Hi, everyone. This is Kale Mary,
And this is Soda.
and we're back with another podcast at Space Trio. This time we're going to be talking about villains of Star Trek. Go ahead, Soda.
The thing about villains is that I think in Star Trek there are less villains, like strictly villains. There are a few like villain races that are opposing Federation, but outright villains are very rare.
In fact, I think a lot of the storylines, at least in the original series of Star Trek, not so much having a villain of the day, right? But maybe a moral to the story. The Enterprise encounters a situation on a planet where this is the way that race, does whatever it is they're doing, like the episode where they have population control, right? And so a lot of the themes in Star Trek were not so much about saying right and wrong, it's about moral dilemma or just how much diversity there could be in the universe and these sometimes really odd situations that the Enterprise crew would find themselves in. But that being said, there are villainous characters in the original series, and some of them do make reappearances, even into the movies.
Yeah, well, there are exactly two villains that make reappearances, I think. One of them is Mud, which also comes back in Discovery. Is there something to talk about Mud? Is there a reason to talk about Mud?
I think we might talk about Mud as one of those villains that are popular outside of canon material.
Hmm.
But I think to start with, we should probably talk about the villains that were introduced in the original series and have kind of carried on through other Star Trek franchises. And the main, I will say, what we consider the villains of, or the enemies of, the Federation itself.
Okay, so let's start. I think we should start with the Klingons because in the original series they were villains, but
Yes.
then they weren't. I think it's a pretty good example of what we just talked about how Star Trek doesn't really need villains because, yeah, in the original series the stand-ins for the USSR, for the Soviet Union, and by the time of the Next Generation, when the Cold War was waning, they weren't needed as villains anymore. So they turned into allies.
That's true. What's interesting is that not only did they turn into allies, but we kind of rescued them from this perilous situation that their empire found itself in.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because The Undiscovered Country, the movie that basically told of how we saved the Federation, how the Federation saved the Klingons, yeah,
Yeah.
came out much later than The Next Generation, which is the series that made the Klingons allies. So they kind of had in mind the fact that the Klingons are going to be the friends of the Federation before they figured out how it's going to happen.
That's a really interesting point. And not to mention the fact that they even have a Klingon serving on a Starfleet vessel in the Next Generation itself.
Yeah, and he's the first one also.
Right. That right there tells you something has changed in the relationship between the Federation and the Empire, or is changing, or is about to change.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, every to focus on at least one new alien race and develop it. And in the original series, it was pretty much the Vulcans, I think. But in the Next Generation, it was the Klingons. And because the Next Generation lasted for so long, we know a lot about the Klingons, like a lot.
Yeah.
And it's funny to see how many things are different from what we knew in the original series. They look different. They have a very different culture from what it looks like. And because of the time gap between the series, you kind of have to accept it's a retcon, basically. It's a retroactive continuity. We are supposed to assume that this is how it's always been because the original series didn't have the budget to show it exactly, and because the original series relied more on us, extrapolating things from little moments, and we couldn't have a continuity because there weren't even VHR tapes things like that. So it's interesting.
Can we talk about, in the original series, just the different Klingons we see? I think the first Klingon is it Kor in Errand of Mercy?
Is it Kor or Koloth?
Well, it's his name is Kor, but there's a that this is the episode with the Organians.
The Organians, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so we see that this Klingon commander Kor has essentially situated himself on the planet of Organia because he wants to conquer it for the Empire. But by the end of the episode, he's kind of, well, let's put it, disgusted with the Organians because they don't even want to fight back. And for me, this is like the first time you really see that Klingons are supposed to be, well, not only ruthless conquerors, but they have this really deep desire to do battle with anyone. Even though at the time it's mainly Kor against Kirk, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's mainly Kor against Kirk, and Spock trying to stop Kirk from making an intergalactic incident. Yeah.
I think we see that maybe the Klingons in this portrayal, or at least through this one Klingon or a couple of Klingons that are in the episode, they're a very militarized group of people.
Yeah.
More so than the Starfleet is supposed to be.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't think in the original series, especially in the first season, I don't think even the creators, the people, the script writers, they didn't really know yet if they want Starfleet to be like a military fleet or a research organization with some military capabilities.
Yeah.
So in this capacity, in this episode, it was more like it was kind of both, because they didn't come to Organia, if I remember correctly, they didn't come to Organia originally because of the Klingons, right?
No, but they went to Organia because they wanted to bring them in as part of the Federation because they had they were close to the neutral zone. Isn't that correct?
Yeah.
And then they realized the Klingons are already there trying to make a deal with the Organians.
Yeah. Something like that. And they also are very surprised about the Organian perceived lack of technology and advancement.
It's really interesting is that, for me, Kor is probably one of the Klingon commanders in the original series that stood out to me. And I'm not sure why, but I think it's because in the episode he actually acknowledges Kirk as a worthy adversary.
I think it's going to be like a theme in the Klingon episode, in the Klingon appearances in general, that Kirk is like this mythical Starfleet captain that can stand up to them. They appreciate him because he has such tactical capabilities.
Yes.
Because they mostly see Starfleet as like this peaceful, bunch of cowards.
I think the next Klingon is Kolith, isn't it, in the Trouble with Tribbles?
Yeah, Kolith is the one trouble, yeah.
I have to say it, but I feel like this whole episode just made a kind of like a mockery of who the Klingons were, because at the end you realize that these big badass warriors who run this empire and conquer whole worlds are basically like squeamish and almost terrified by little furball tribbles.
On the one hand, yes, but on the other, it's kind of like, I like this aspect of how alien they are. Like, it's because there's something about the species of the Tribble and the species of the Klingons that's like,
it's hilarious.
Scares them for something. But what else is interesting? It's that Kodos and the Klingons in Trouble with Tribbles look different than the Klingons in Errand of Mercy.
Yes, he did. He was actually did he have less facial hair and
he both had less facial hair
and lighter skin.
Lighter skin in the sense that he didn't lather him up in shoe polish.
Yeah. To me, he seemed more like a political adversary than he did a militarized one, because he wasn't like immediately drawing his phaser wanting to like shoot Kirk and, raid the space station or whatever. He was more about, like, he was pompous. That's what I remember about
Yeah.
him.
Yeah, he was more of a diplomat, and he was more sarcastic. And like you mentioned, in the case of Core, when we saw them as the Klingons being very militant and gung-ho about fighting and all of that, in these episodes they're kind of sneaky, and they send spies and people undercover. There's a Klingon undercover agent posing as a human, I think.
Yes, that's exactly. You see another side to the Klingons that you might not have expected, because Core made you think that they're very like in your face, and if they want to do battle with you or they want to take over, your ship or something, they're going to let you know, and they're just going to do it. Whereas here you have a whole like group of Klingons trying to insinuate themselves, like you said, in an underhanded, sneaky way into the circumstances that had brought Kirk to the station itself. And then you have this whole scene where you actually have Kirk's crew and the Klingons having this brawl in a cafeteria or some kind of space station lounge. It's as if we needed to know just how antagonistic they are when the Federation and the Klingon Empire meet each other. I don't know.
Yeah.
That was hilarious to me also, because it's like they were middle school children who like had gotten two like little band of thugs together and were having a fight in the alleyway or something.
Yeah, I think it's pretty intentional about how many things in this episode are funny. But it's interesting that we don't really see this side of the Klingon Empire until like
the movie.
The movie. Do we have Klingon spies in the movie?
There are. I'm thinking about the Undiscovered Country. There are a lot of spies and stuff, but there's also is it Gorkin, the basically the Klingon that McCoy has to operate on?
But he wasn't a spy. He was like,
no, but he was a diplomat.
He was a diplomat, but I don't think it's that like the Klingons obviously have diplomats, but they're always like, we are noble people who fight, and we are not cowards, and we don't hide, and we don't use underhanded tactics, and like we kind of see that it's not true. You do use underhanded tactics sometimes.
Yeah.
But that part was kind of ignored until like Discovery, basically.
Yeah, I have to say, once again, the Star Trek franchise has kind of turned some of the Klingon mythos on its head again just by Discovery alone. Yeah, they've added a lot more. I don't know. I think that's a result of the way they portrayed the Klingons in the Abrams verse. Because guess what? You got Klingons showing up in these rebooted movies, and not only do they look like fantastical. I mean, they're supposed to be in this in-between stage, when they're undergoing this physical transformation that takes them from the original series Klingons to the next generation Klingons. They're a lot more rugged looking, darker skins. They're starting to have the ridges, and they have a lot of like almost like a tribal jewelry, if you will, like attached to their their ears and their ridges, and then of course you could tell they're completely militarized. They're in all this armor and with these weapons, and they snarl and they look mean and they glare at people, and then of course Uhura kind of like kicks their ass. Yeah, it's almost feel like, and it was a shame that Abrams in the reboot movies used the Klingons as he had to put a Klingon or Klingons in the Star Trek movies, and he just did it in such a way that they were, I don't know how to put it, they weren't a part of the storyline so much as they were to say, oh look, it's this Star Trek thing that you love called Klingons, and they're very vicious, merciless people. And yeah, ignore that because we've got other plot going on. They made their appearance, is what I'm trying to say. which is a shame because there was a lot of potential to use them in this espionage way, sort of just like you're talking about, because there's this whole like Cold War going on with the Klingons and the Federation when the movies are start.
Yeah, I think it could also, I mean, it could also fix the whole problem of why are the Klingon cultures so different between the Next Generation and the original series than the alternate original series, the Abrams movies. They could have done like a combination of that. Like, here is the Klingon culture as we know it after it was developed in the Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and so forth. But here it is in the original series time frame.
Mm-hmm. They had in the first movie, Star Trek 2009, they had one very brief scene, and it might have even been cut out and been a deleted scene, where the actual villain of the movie, Nero, who's a Romulan, has come from this alternate timeline, and he's been captured during this period of time by the Klingons. He's fallen into Klingon hands, and he's like in one of their prisons being tortured for information. And this is the period at which the Klingons are so supposed to be like undergoing this physical transformation. Show that in the way that they're like their features look distorted, and they're wearing these like big heavy helmets. But this is like a 5-second scene, okay? A 5-second scene of Nero being tortured by Klingons who kind of look like the original series Klingons, but that are on their way to being the Next Generation. And then that's it. And that was like Abrams' like 5-second scene of, oh look, there's something going on here. Because I think this is something Star Trek fans want to see. For 5 seconds. So, and it's a shame because some of the actual subplot of the second movie, Into Darkness, which is, of course, Khan is the main villain of that movie, but the subplot is that you have this Admiral, Alexander Marcus, who is head of this secret section of Starfleet called Section 31, and they're like the spies of Starfleet. And their agenda, which not everybody knows this, but their agenda is to basically spy on the Klingons and other enemies of the Federation, collect intel, so they're like CIA or something. But Marcus thinks that war with the Klingons is inevitable. He uses Khan as an instrument to kind of spark that war with the Klingons. So there's this whole subplot about Federation Klingon relationship like coming to a head in a bad way. But it gets overshadowed by the whole, like, Khan gets loose and has his own agenda and tries to destroy Marcus for using him and blah, 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 blah. But it was really interesting for a second, and I kind of wish they had, like, put more focus on that. Like, wow, we really have some underhanded people in Starfleet itself who are trying to do something. They're not trying to make peace with Klingons. They're actually trying to start a war.
And it's really interesting because, like we said, the Klingons were originally like the USSR stand-ins. There was a Cold War, and for a long time, Americans also thought that a war with the USSR would be inevitable, and eventually it wasn't. It turned out it wasn't. And that really would have made a good movie. And I haven't watched the new movies yet, but everyone tells me that the second one is the worst one, and I think it wouldn't be this way if they focused more on that plot rather than the Khan plot.
Exactly. I think they just overcomplicated things. They had to give a backstory for why Khan was awake in that century and loose and terrorizing people, or actually specifically terrorizing Starfleet, because it's a whole revenge plot movie, okay? It's shockingly just like the Wrath of Khan. Actually, no, not shockingly, because they thought that was a moneymaker. But what I find interesting is, you know how I said there's like this kind of, they're intimating there's this, the Cold War with the Klingons is coming to a head, and somebody, there's actually the potential to go to war with the Klingon Empire. if you backtrack to when they then start Discovery, Discovery is in the middle of the Cold War, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's why I said it made me wonder if they weren't like sort of seeding some of that for the future of the franchise. But then I have to kind of admit that, well, maybe Paramount and CBS don't actually talk to each other. And it was just a coincidence. I don't know.
Look, yeah, I don't think the new movies are really that connected to the TV show.
Yeah.
Maybe the people who wrote Discovery were inspired by the movies.
Yeah. Well, I guess we should at least be glad there's some continuity, even if they're separate timelines.
Yeah.
There's a Cold War with the Klingons.
There is a Cold War. No, I think this is a good segue to the other race that.
Well, before we jump into them, really quick, I think the only other Klingon that we see a lot of in the original series is Kang. Do you remember Kang in Day of the Dove?
Oh, yeah, Kang.
Can I just sidetrack really quickly? It surprised me when I first watched that episode that his wife was also his science officer. Can we just talk about that? I mean, it technically is the first time we see a female Klingon, which looks, of course, nothing like the female Klingons in the Next Generation, but
yeah. Actually, I think she looked kind of similar to the first. Well, the first female Klingon we see in the Next Generation is half Klingon, half human. So she kind of looked like her, actually. But yeah, the interesting thing is that for all of the Klingons were the villains and the evil race, we shall call them. They also seem to be pretty progressive. Like, it's not like they were militant and also
all male.
Didn't have all male. Yeah,
they left their women at home.
Yeah, not only did they not leave their women at home, they also had science officers. Like, you wouldn't expect that, considering all the times you saw them before, they were mostly fighting.
Right. So it makes me wonder if even then they were toying with the idea that Klingons as a warrior race, if you will, that meant all Klingons, not just, whether they were male or female. That they all had this like ambition to find a good fight and perhaps an honorable one at that, but that's something that called to them no matter what their gender was.
It's possible.
Yeah.
But also there's the fact that they had science officers. Like, would you expect the Klingons to have like straight up scientific officers going along with them on their battleships?
I would hope they would at least acknowledge that if they didn't have somebody who was smart enough to check if the planet had air, that, trying to, that they could breathe down there or do what they had to do, that, conquering other worlds that are completely different than their own would be much harder without science.
Yeah.
Not to mention that, they have actual battleships, right? They have to have engineers too. And if they get sick, they gotta have doctors, so I don't know.
I'm not surprised that they have science officers in general. I'm just surprised they have science officers on battleships.
Well, I felt like that was a dig at Spock. Don't ask me why. It just felt like you had this Klingon commander Kang who was all about doing battle with the Enterprise crew and taking over the ship, and the one who spoke sense to him was his female science officer. Kind of like Spock speaks sense to Kirk sometimes when Kirk gets a little exuberant.
Yeah. Also, that was the third season. By that point, they probably knew they had a very big fan base of shippers.
Well, the good thing is, I think this episode, Day of the Devil, was the first time we also saw that Klingons had some nuance to what they called their Klingon honor. Because, once Kirk is finally able to reveal that it's some foreign entity, third-party entity that is actually driving them to fight each other, Kang backs off because it's not an honorable battle. So he's not there to just slaughter people for the sake of slaughtering people. It's not a fight that he can, claim accreditation for through the eyes of his people because he was manipulated. Well, how about we move on to the Romulans?
Yeah, so it's time to talk about the second race that first appeared in the original series and then moved on to the other series in the franchise.
And played none other than Mark Leonard, who also played Spock's father.
Yeah, that was really funny for watching both episodes the first time because the first episode he appeared. I love this episode, but I just now forgot its name.
You mean Journey to Babel?
No. The first episode that he appeared as a Romulan.
Oh,
Balance of Terror.
Balance of Terror. Yeah.
So the thing is, he was a main character in the episode, and it was a good episode. It was a very memorable episode. So it's not like he was like this minor character in the background of some episode and then came back as Spock's father. It was like this really important character in a very good episode that then came back as Spock's father in another good episode, and that was pretty funny actually.
Yeah, it's actually strange. He had the pointed Romulan ears before he had the Vulcan ears.
They're basically the same ears. So.
I know. The same makeup.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting because he's our introduction to Romulans, right? And we basically learn that the Romulans also have this neutral zone with the Federation, and the Enterprise and this Romulan commander ship are playing a like cat and mouse game in the neutral zone to see who can, basically spark a war first or avoid one.
Exactly, and I think it's interesting that the Romulan culture, as it was presented in the original series, is actually more similar to how the Klingon culture is later presented in the Next Generation.
It makes you wonder if they just were going off the premise that the enemies of the Federation would naturally be more inclined to battle with someone. That's not the case, obviously, going forward in the franchise, but yeah, you kind of did get that feeling, right? Like, oh, Romulans like to fight, but actually it turned out to be more of a game of intelligence, didn't it? Because they were basically trying to outmaneuver each other, not so much, like Klingons running straight into battle and trying to take over Kirk's ship as a trophy, but the Romulan commander was basing his moves off of how Kirk responded.
The interesting thing about both the first appearances of the Klingons and the Romulans is that they both also hint that it's not set in stone. It's not like they were born to fight. It's their culture, but it's not something that they are like genetically predisposed to fight the Federation. The Klingons, after the Klingons in the end of the first episode and the end of Errand of Mercy, the Organians tell them one day you're going to be friends with the Federation. And in the Romulan case, you see this race that had this terrible war with the Federation that, people still talk about it in the Federation.
Right.
But this Romulan commander is trying to avoid a war. He doesn't actually want to start another war.
It's true. He's supposed to be like a weary of fighting. Yet you can see how intelligent he is.
Exactly. He's presented basically as the Kirk of the Romulan Empire.
And also the more warlike versions of Vulcans, because they do make a whole point of showing that Romulans and Vulcans are, have common ancestry.
Even more interesting because they have common ancestry, and you see how the Vulcan culture developed and how the Romulan culture developed. It's actually something that I'm kind of sorry they didn't go on with in the Next Generation. In the Next Generation, the Romulans look much different, like noticeably different than Vulcans.
Yes.
And I thought it was like, I didn't really like this design decision because I thought it was more interesting that the Romulans and Vulcans looked practically the same.
They just had different ideologies.
Exactly.
So I guess the next time we see the Romulans is during this whole spy mission. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. There are a few more episodes where they're like talked about, but they're not really there.
And then there's the Enterprise incident.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, it's not Mark Leonard. It's actually a female Romulan commander.
Yeah, and we saw a female Romulan commander before we saw a female human captain in the Federation.
Yes, we did. And she is a pretty sharp one, too.
Yeah.
I would almost say she's a little more ruthless than the way Romulans were presented by Mark Leonard's portrayal.
Yeah, but I think it's because Mark Leonard portrayed like an older general.
Yeah, who had been through the wars.
Yeah, and she was young.
And ambitious.
Comparatively. Exactly.
She's very ambitious to take on the Enterprise.
Yeah.
She wanted that trophy. I find it very interesting here because this is the first time you see Spock actually interact with someone of Romulan heritage.
Yeah, especially after how tense it was for him when they found out how Romulans looked.
And yeah, you had that moment of where Kirk tells his helmsman to keep bigotry off the bridge.
Later, Spock, in the Next Generation, Spock becomes very hell-bent on bridging the gap between Romulans and Vulcans. So much so that he infiltrates Romulus and starts spreading like unity between them underground or something like that.
And that's actually some of the canon material they use to create the rebooted universe. The first rebooted movie, the Abrams verse movie, is a Romulan. Okay, and it's these Romulans who've been displaced by the black hole into this alternate timeline. They're set on revenge, or the commander, Nero, is set on revenge. And they look nothing like the Romulans you've seen in the series to date. Okay, this guy looks like he could be a space pirate. He's got shaved head and blue tattoos and this like hard armor on, and it just seems like he's kind of crazy. Like he's mad. He's gone mad, which is probably the case because, prior to them coming through the black hole, Romulus planet was consumed by a supernova. So the whole planet was destroyed, and Spock was on his way to alert the planet Romulus that they were in imminent danger, and didn't make it in time. Yeah, it's actually kind of crazy because it means that these people who have just come to this black hole have witnessed the destruction of an entire planet. And that actually then plays a theme into the rest of the movie. Basically, it's a revenge movie, and the Romulans they're not given, other than the backstory of how they got there and why they're so crazy and hell-bent on revenge against Spock himself. And they want to cause destruction of the planet Earth just because it's part of the revenge plot. There's not a whole lot about them outside of that. It's a shame because we've basically seen that the franchise has spent some time working on the characterization of the Romulan race, right?
Yeah.
And then so they become throwaway villains in the first movie of the Abrams verse. At least that's the way I looked at it.
Yeah. They don't go on. There are no more Romulans in the next movies?
Not so much, no. They're kind of a background, again, one of those subplots, because supposedly, Romulus of the alternate timeline does not acknowledge the actions of this crazy commander named Nero. He's not even from their timeline, right? He's like, well, but it also goes to show you that Romulus itself and the Romulan Empire is not on good standing with the Federation anyway, but they tend to keep to their sides of the neutral zone.
Yeah.
After that, you really don't see much of them You see less of the Romulans in the remainder of the movies than you do the Klingons.
Wow. All right. Yeah.
I guess they're not that interesting on the big screen. We talk really quick about, well, you mentioned it, right? Spock gets really gung-ho about trying to unify
Yeah.
essentially the Romulans. So can we talk about his protege?
Yeah. Which one? Which of them? Oh, the Christialis one.
Yes.
Savick, of course.
Savick, yes.
Savick, yes. Okay, Savick. The thing is, Savick wasn't really confirmed to be a Romulan in canon, was she? She was like confirmed later in a novel or something like that.
To be half.
Yeah, half Romulan. I think it's interesting that the Romulan culture was never, at least as far as I could see, it was never as well defined as, say, the Klingon culture or the Federation. There isn't like this one thing that really defines them as a culture.
Other than the fact that they share ancestry with the Vulcans. That was their most defining, probably the most defining knowledge that we had.
Yeah, and I think we sort of kind of, a lot of fans extrapolated from that, because you have like, it was hinted that the Vulcan culture, of course, wasn't always this logic based. They had the pre-Surak times that were very militant, and they had a lot of wars, and it's basically theorized among fans that basically is what Vulcan culture would look like if not for Surak.
Yes, I think that was the original premise. These are your warlike Vulcan people, and this is what the Vulcans could be had they not embraced the teachings of Surak. Is there anything else you want to talk about when it comes to the Romulans?
Just my personal theory that the reason I have a personal theory that is supported by absolutely nothing, that part of the reason that Spock went back to Romulus is he wanted to look for that Romulan commander again.
That's an interesting theory.
Yeah. Again, supported by nothing.
Nothing but hopes and dreams. Okay.
Yeah, I'll say this. I won't get into it because I think we have an episode on the docket that's like gets into that. But if we had to ship Spock with someone who is not part of the triumvirate, I'd probably be the Romulan commander. They had great chemistry.
Yeah, they did. Okay. That's interesting, Soda. So before we go on to kind of the big villain, I'd like for a second to talk about maybe villains that were popular in Fanon more than they are in canon, even though they had, say, maybe like 1 or 2 appearances only in the original series.
Okay.
The first one that comes to mind, of course, is Harry Mudd. Harry Mudd is the equivalent to your space pirate conman. And he's like that snake oil salesman that is always trying to sell you an illusion. Anyway, and I find it funny that as far as a villain goes, he's not an evil one, but he's a very selfish, self-centered one. And
I think that's his whole thing. Like,
yeah,
if your heroes are like selfless and heroic, then it stands to reason that an antagonist, not exactly a villain, but like an antagonist would be a foil. Let's call him foil. Mm-hmm. Would be someone who's like very selfish. He doesn't really hate the Federation or anything. He just, he's out for himself.
Right. It's all about how he's going to make his profit. And so we have him in 2 episodes. Basically, Mudd's Women and I Mudd.
Yeah.
And I think
I Mudd was much better than Mudd Women.
It was. And I think Harry Mudd actually owns it a little more as a villain in I Mudd than he does in the first time we see him, because he's not trying to sell anything in that second appearance, right?
Yeah.
He's trapped Kirk and some of his crew on this android planet. And it's a little bit of revenge.
It is a little bit of revenge because, but again, it's not because he hates them specifically. It's because they did something that is basically inconvenience him, right? They made
Mm-hmm.
they caused him to be imprisoned, and now he wants out.
And oh, lo and behold, here they are, and he can use them to his advantage to get out of prison and get a little bit of
Exactly.
comeuppance in the process.
He's just very petty. He's very petty. He's
Yes,
very,
petty is the perfect word.
yeah.
But I really enjoyed the way the actor played Harry Mudd in the original series because he was your typical boisterous conman, and it really irritated the heck out of Kirk, which I found funny.
Yeah. Well, he also appeared in Discovery, obviously.
Yes, tell me about that.
Well, in Discovery, he was a little nastier in Discovery. I think, if that's possible. Just he was meaner. He was like vicious in Discovery. It was like he was imprisoned. He was imprisoned along with two other Federation officers by the Klingons, and basically the Klingons would pick one of the three people they had to torture, and he always, he was a spy for the Klingons, so they won't torture him.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty serious.
Yeah, he's a little nastier in the Discovery. He does have another episode where he's a little funnier because the premise of the episode is a little lighter. Basically, he creates a time loop using some illegal materials because he wants to take revenge against one of the officers he was imprisoned with, because that officer they pretty much left him there with the Klingons, and he got out, and now he wants revenge. So he does like a time loop, and Discovery is a little darker.
Well, just in general, yes.
Than the original series and the Next Generation. So it makes sense that Mud is nastier, but the ending is very. Basically, at the end, you remember his wife from iMud?
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, the end, they kind of more or less force him to marry her.
Oh. Yeah, that is funny. That plays a little into the canon. I like that. So here's something interesting. They didn't forget about Mud in the Abrams verse either.
Okay.
This is why I think he's sort of just like a popular name or popular character as a villain of the original series cast, because in the second movie, when Kirk is going to chase after KHAAAN, basically to the Klingon home world, they use Mud's ship. And so it's sort of like a throwaway mention, but they do mention that, the ship like the trade ship they have in dock in the Enterprise is actually Harry Mudd's ship that they basically commandeered when they probably picked him up for some scheme or other. And so they use that ship to get to the Klingon home world in disguise, if you will, to follow KHAAAN. And so he's still mentioned in the Abrams verse. And I don't know, this is just, it's probably just to make Trek fans laugh, but I find it interesting that even the writers who are making a series of movies for the average moviegoer who would know nothing about Star Trek thought it would be funny to mention Mud. And so that really speaks to me, because I find in Fanon that fans tend to like the idea of Harry Mudd as a comeback villain. If you're going to write an interesting, just an interesting little action story, who better to have to be irritating Kirk or, in the middle of some bigger, more heinous plot than Harry Mudd, the space pirate slash
Yeah.
con man. Most Trek fans, I think, do know who Harry Mudd is, even if they're not, huge fans of, like, say, the original series. And just the fact that now even more of them are going to know who he is based on Discovery.
So yeah, I think he will. I think he will even return in the next season, if I'm not mistaken. There's a possibility.
That wouldn't surprise me at all. Another villain that for me seems more popular to fans than probably was in canon, and is actually a pretty interesting one, is Trelane.
Trelane.
The Squire of Gothos.
Yeah, and he also, the actor that plays Trelane also plays Kodos.
Yes, he does. He plays a Klingon. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
I think what interests me about Trelane is that he's the prototype for a Q.
Yeah, basically.
And so it's like this first time you get this idea of this omnipotent being with all these powers that humans cannot comprehend and probably not even defend against. A race of beings out there who are that powerful and pretty much can make you do whatever you want. Well, in this case, Trelane happens to be the child version of those omnipotent beings because he doesn't have the emotional or intellectual control over his powers that an adult would, and therefore he's using Kirk and his crew like playthings because he's lonely.
Yeah. But I think it also implied that if he was a mature Q, a mature being, he wouldn't even want to deal with them because
they're so
boring.
beneath him. Right, they're so beneath him. They are this sub-race, subspecies in the galaxy that, it's like us wanting to play with ants or something.
Yeah, exactly. He's an interesting character.
He is an interesting character because when you first start the episode, you're like, wow, how is Kirk going to get out of this one?
Yeah, but the interesting thing is that it's not... if we tie him to the Q, it was never confirmed it's actually Q, If we tie him to the Q can literally make anything out of anything. Trelane he had some connection to his, place where he was living that he needed to make things.
Yeah. That's why I call him the prototype for the Q, because they kind of refined the idea of a race like that and then obviously invented the Q for the next generation.
Yeah. An interesting note about the Q, though, maybe it's not very relevant to the original series, but I think that originally the Q themselves were supposed to have split into two different races. And Guinan for the next generation, I think she was supposed to be also a Q, but the good Q, not the bad Q.
Oh, there's a good and a bad. I didn't know that. I thought they were all just kind of arrogant.
I think this was the original concept, that then they scrapped it, and Guinan, they never actually called Guinan the race anything. They never actually named them or told who they are and where they came from. They never actually revealed that. But the first few times that Q met Guinan, he was very afraid of her. And I think, what can make a Q afraid? Another Q.
Right. That's interesting. And as you know, Q, of course, was definitely one of the primary villains in the Next Generation.
I wouldn't call him a villain.
No, but I mean, he's a nemesis in some regard, right? He's
a nuisance.
He is a nuisance, but in some way he is also a nemesis to Picard. So I find it like an interesting comparison that, had Trelane had more appearances, he could have been the same to Kirk.
He could have been. But...
I could guarantee you that Kirk would have thought of him in the same regard that Picard thought of Q.
Yeah, but I think the point of Q in the Next Generation was that at first he was like, let's play with the ants, let's torture them a little.
Yeah.
But slowly over the series, he started to like the humans. He started to grow empathy toward humans, and that's kind of the journey he went through the whole series. And there are other aliens in the original series that did that in like an episode. I don't think they could have stretched it over a season because of the nature of the series in the 60s. Like, they didn't really have an overarching, stories.
Yeah. Another popular, quote, villain that stemmed from the original series and does get mentioned a couple of times in the Abrams verse is the Gorn.
The Gorn.
The
Yeah,
Gorn!
He's not famous, he's infamous. Yeah.
He's infamous, yes. Who can forget that great episode where Kirk has to reinvent the firearm to defeat a Gorn?
I genuinely love this episode, but yeah, the Gorn fight is like it's the worst fight in the entire Star Trek franchise.
Well, how do you even fight in that costume? I mean, so the Gorn is basically a giant bipedal humanoid lizard type being. Yet they are also supposedly a militarized type of race. They have, we have this commander Gorn, like Kirk is captain of his ship. You have this Gorn who was in charge of his vessel, and the two of them are put on this planet.
Well, I actually don't really know anything about the Gorn as a race, because from their perspective, we just came and took over their planet. So from their perspective, we are the aggressors. It's not like I think that was the point of the episode, if I remember correctly, that like we didn't stop, and Kirk didn't stop and think about how the Federation's actions looked like from the Gorn perspective. Because from the Gorn perspective, it was like, some people we've never met who speak a language we don't understand just come to our planet and settle on it, and basically they have a military base there. There's an admiral living there.
You know what I find even more interesting? That they actually mention this in the rebooted movies. Okay, McCoy has this line where talks about how he's delivered Gorn octuplets.
That's interesting.
Talking about how the little bastards bite, and so you have to wonder, how is it that McCoy comes to deliver baby Gorns? They don't actually explain that, so you don't know if he's just been in this circumstance where he has to do something for the Gorns, or if the Gorns may actually be a member of the Federation in that alternate timeline. Who knows?
I think the most reasonable explanation for this is the Klingon case, in which like J.J. Abrams was like, hey, here is a name the fans will recognize, let's put it in there somehow, somewhere.
Again, if you talk to fans, one of the things they know is the Gorn. But that's primarily because you had this guy in this big old rubber suit fighting Kirk in the original series, and probably everybody thought it was hilarious. I will mention that I do think they tried to bring the Gorns back in Enterprise series, in one of the Mirror Universe episodes, but I've never actually watched it. I just know that they did mention the Gorns there too, so it's funny. It's just funny to me. It'd be nice if the Gorns ever get around to using the universal translator so we can understand what the Gorns are hissing. Yeah, and unfortunately
it's not going to be in Discovery because it's a prequel.
Yeah, that's so true. Can you think of another popular villain?
I don't know how popular he is actually, but I have seen him in fan fiction, which to me means he's sort of popular. But he's also not exactly a villain because he doesn't actually appear in the episode. Finnegan, Kirk's childhood bully.
Okay, this is going to get me onto a subject, Soda. Kind of a tangent here. The tangent is that half of the villains or enemies in the episodes of the original series are personally out to get Kirk. I don't know if you've noticed that. There's a number of them in the original series. And Finnegan, like you said, it doesn't actually make an appearance in an episode, but it is mentioned that Kirk used to be bullied by this person named Finnegan, and people just seem to pick up on that.
Yeah, I just want to say it's like, it's not that Finnegan, that we don't know how he looked like. Like there is a robot version of him, of Finnegan in the planet, the shore-lived planet that can make anything you think about real. So we kind of see him as Kirk remembers him, I guess.
Yes.
And the thing about Finnegan, I just want to ask: is Finnegan mentioned in? Is Finnegan a character in fan fiction of the alternate series, or?
Oh yeah, and that's actually going to lead me into probably the last kind of like popular villain I want to talk about before we get to our final major one. I have to say, it's a pretty popular notion to take anyone who has ever wronged Kirk or wanted revenge against Kirk and put them into alternate timeline stories. Well, one, because we don't have a lot of material that comes out of that timeline anyway, but it just helps build the background, this backstory for Kirk that we don't have. And so, of course, people pull material from the original series. Finnegan's definitely one.
Yeah.
You know, another is Janice Lester.
Yeah.
Who gets a whole episode. The last episode of the series. You know, she's got a personal grudge against Kirk. We see in Court Martial, Finney. I find it funny that his name's Finney. Ben Finney, or whoever he is, has a personal grudge against Kirk from when they were ensigns on whatever the Farragut or whatever that ship was they served together on.
There's I don't know if you mean that one, but there's the witch from Catspaw.
Oh yes. Oh, and then there's of course Gary Mitchell. Gary doesn't particularly have a grudge against Kirk, right? Because he's actually his friend. He goes off the rails when he gets all these godlike powers, and it's upon Kirk to save the day. But Gary Mitchell is definitely someone I've seen recreated in the rebooted movies in fan fiction, because again, he's this character we know well from the original series associated with Kirk, yet there's a tragic backstory there.
Do you see him often appearing as a villain? Because usually when I see him, he's like, there are some people who ship him with Kirk, and then they like break up, and maybe he's jealous of Kirk's new boyfriend Spock or something like that. But most of
I've seen him as a villain pretty often. I don't know why that is.
Maybe because the first time we saw him, he did try to kill Kirk. In the first and only time we saw him.
So what percentage would you say of the original series are villains associated with Kirk? A third of them, right?
Yeah, but the thing is that Kirk is kind of like the main character of the original series. He's the only character that appears in every episode.
But how many times can your personal demons come back to haunt you? In so many different ways. I mean, talk about the entity cloud, right?
Yeah, I know.
Or the cloud entity or whatever it is that, that makes him lose his common sense for a little bit. So that really brings me to one last popular villain. And this is super popular in the rebooted universe. Yeah. And that's Kodos the Executioner.
Kodos. I mean, Chassis 4 is very, very popular as a plot point in a lot of Kirk-centered fan fiction. I'm sure in both the new series, but especially in the original series. The series kind of forgot about Tarsus V after that episode. Like, I think it was only mentioned once again in Enterprise, and that's it. No one ever talked about it again, but the fans keep bringing it up again and again and again.
Yeah, so it's very popular in Fanon. Like you said, the whole concept is so tragic, really tragic. If you're gonna watch, a whole if you're gonna be part of genocide, right? Genocide, that's what it is. One of the few survivors of genocide. That's about as tragic as your backstory could get. Yeah, I think it really became popular among fans, and it has never been mentioned in the rebooted universe. Not a single mention about that backstory for Kirk, and yet it is probably the most popular Fanon backstory for Jim Kirk in the rebooted universe. I cannot tell you how many stories I have seen where, in some capacity, there is a reference to Kodos and Tarsus colony.
I think I saw like a gif from the new movies that they did mention like Tarsus before by name, but not really what happened there or something like that.
No,
No,
it might have been. I would have to go look for that,
I
but
mean,
as many times as I've seen the movies, I don't think I've ever. If it was done in very brief passing, or it could have been done in a deleted scene.
maybe that was it.
But I guarantee you that it would not have been mentioned in a way that a lot of folks would have picked up on. However, I don't think that has in any way stopped the fandom from making that a central part of Kirk's tragic backstory. I mean, not only did his father die, you know, when he was born, and apparently he's got this abusive stepfather or uncle. But why not have Kirk have been shipped off to the Tarsus colony when he was in his preteens and have been a survivor of genocide? So I'm not sure why it's so popular, but it just is.
I mean, I think I know why it's popular because it's very tragic, and people kind of like, yeah, people kind of like the tragedy of it, I think.
So, what did you think about Kodos himself? Because Kodos is actually portrayed as, well, one, he is known as Kodos the Executioner, but he was the governor of the colony who ordered you know, the destruction of part of the colony's population, which he rationalized as preserving the other half of the colony because they were running out of food supply. Yet he gets away, and he has gone into essentially hiding for a few decades, and yet here he is playing Caridian, this Shakespearean actor ish, who's traveling around this galactic troupe of actors, and he's a villain who's supposed to redeem himself. I mean, if you think about the way he dies at the end of the episode, right?
The thing is, I'm not sure he's supposed to have redeemed himself.
Well, no, you cannot redeem yourself from genocide.
Yeah, no, I think even the series kind of acknowledges that. Like,
Yeah.
I don't Kirk, like, okay, the bad thing about Kodos is not specifically that not that he just killed people, that he supposedly killed them because he had this all mind eugenic based ideology, and he chose who to kill based on their genetic purity or something. I don't remember exactly what it was. Yeah, and the thing is that the excuses that he gives Kirk about why he did what he did, he doesn't appear to be like, the series doesn't present it like, yes, that's a good excuse. It's like he's very obviously just coming up with excuses.
Right, because you can't justify that.
Yeah,
and he doesn't particularly seem remorseful either.
Yeah, exactly.
I think he's supposed to just, well, I did what I had to do and I got away with it, and I'm not doing anything bad right now, so you should just forgive me for my sins and move on.
Yeah. And he's also like, oh, I can't leave as Kodos anymore. I'm on the run. I paid the price for what I did. Like, yeah, not really, but okay.
And yet, at the end, he still dies by jumping in between.
Yeah, I think that the writers of the episode, on one hand, didn't want Kirk to basically come out like a murderer.
No, of course
because
not.
He's killing this. But on the other hand, they can't really let a guy who committed genocide just walk away.
I will argue that I think they could have had Kirk do what is the right thing, which Kirk is always supposed to do, right? It's
Yeah.
Kirk's responsibility to turn Kodos over to the authorities
Yeah.
and have him essentially, go to trial for his crimes. That could have been how they ended the episode, but they didn't do that. Yeah, they had Kodos die. And he didn't just accidentally get shot either. So that's why I just find it awkward. Because it really, in a sense, I don't think it gives Kirk any closure, even though Kodos is finally dead.
Yeah, it doesn't. The thing is, I don't think it would have given him closure even if Kodos would have gone to the authorities, because even then it's like he doesn't regret anything that he did.
All right, I think maybe.
Oh, I think it's time to talk about the.
Since we're talking of people who do not regret their actions.
And since we're talking about the most memorable villainous from the original series.
Yes. So his name is Noonien Singh, played by Ricardo Montalban in the original series in the episode Space Seed. Essentially, Khan is a superhuman, if you will, who has come from a period in Earth's history where he was a dictator, almost like an Alexander the Great, right? So kind of like almost like a conqueror. He wasn't a conqueror of the whole earth, but he, was involved in the eugenics wars where he was essentially like taking over whole countries with his superhuman offshoot of the human race. Essentially because he felt that they were superior and therefore should be ruling the people of Earth. And of course that doesn't work out and they escape.
Yeah.
And end up in sleeper status on this ship that gets somehow picked up by the Enterprise.
Yep.
I know. And then, of course, to make matters more interesting, we have aboard the ship this woman who makes it her specialty to understand the history around Earth's conquerors and emperors in that period of history. And so she's fascinated by men like Khan, and lo and behold, here's a real life example of somebody just like an Alexander the Great. I think maybe the premise of the whole episode is, what does somebody like Khan do in the future in something that is futuristic for him, but in the day and age of 23rd century? And the answer is he adapts very quickly. Because his essential ideology is that he is still superior, and therefore he needs to find his own world to rule over.
Yeah. I'll say this. I didn't like the original series, the Space Seed. I didn't like it. I didn't think it was a very good episode, and I don't think people today would still think it was a good episode if not for the movie. I don't think the movie retroactively makes this episode better than what it is.
I'm not going to say it was a great episode because it wasn't, but I understand what they were trying to do with that, and I found it really interesting that they brought him back. And you just have to wonder, why is it Khan? Is it because he is the one Kirk let get away? And that essentially is what comes back to haunt Kirk, his decision to let Khan have his own world to rule over. And that turns into Khan's revenge because it didn't work out and he and went crazy.
Basically, yes. I mean, I think basically yes.
Khan as a villain in Space Seed was to me much more palatable than Khan, the crazy villain in The Wrath of Khan.
Look, Ricardo Montalban is very charismatic. I like him.
Oh,
as an
absolutely.
Actor. I like the way he portrays. I like how he portrays the character in both the episode and the movie. It was different because the character was different, but I liked it. There are problems for me. There are problems with both the episode and the movie that have more not so much to do with Ricardo Montalban and Khan as a character as the way everyone are written around them. Mm-hmm. In the episode, I really didn't like the historian character, the Dr. What was her name? Dr. Marla?
Marla.
Yeah, I really didn't like her. I didn't like the way it was portrayed. How he basically Khan was like this abusive guy that kind of seduced her, and no one on the Enterprise saw anything wrong with just letting her go with him to live on this isolated planet surrounded by Khan's allies.
I know. That's the huge problem with the episode. He essentially not only seduces her, but then he abuses her, not physically somewhat, but definitely, emotionally, because she is fascinated. She's basically obsessed with him, and her obsession overpowers her duty as an officer up until Khan starts to actually murder people. The whole way she's portrayed as a character is not good. But to your point, I think Khan as the charismatic villain fit the bill pretty well for someone as a foil to Kirk. Because, like Kirk, Khan has a loyal group of followers, people who believe in his leadership, and just in the way that the Enterprise crew believes in Kirk's leadership. So Khan isn't. I mean, well, he's a murderer. Let's just be specific. He will kill people, and whereas in Kirk will not. But you have to question, what is it about Kirk's decision to let Khan go that really became the basis for the Wrath of Khan?
Well, I think, first of all, Khan is really one of those villains that Kirk let get away, basically. And there is even this quip in the end of the episode that Spock is like, I wonder what will be of this planet in 100 years. And that makes it like a really good episode to say, hey, yes, let's come back to this episode and see what happened now. And secondly, I think when they made the Wrath of Khan, originally there were a few script ideas. They wanted to, Kirk, one script idea was about Kirk having a son with one of the women that he seduced in the show. And another idea was that a villain from the show would come back to hunt him. And someone said, let's combine those two plots together somehow.
Great idea. and then make a make a series of movies about it.
Well, The Wrath of Khan was pretty popular. It's still pretty popular. It's not my favorite movie of the bunch, but a lot of people like it. So I think they did something good, I guess. I don't know why specifically Khan. Maybe Ricardo Montalban was just available. I don't know.
Again, he did have a good screen presence. I really did not like the way he was insane. I think it's because I preferred him with his with his intellect ruling over, his insanity in Space Seed. Or at least he's basically a megalomaniac with a lot of power. I mean, he's physically stronger than a human, not only more intelligent. I think I just preferred his characterization in Space Seed before he went off the wall. Let me tell you about Khan of the rebooted universe. When it came to light that the second movie, Star Trek Into Darkness, was in production and that Benedict Cumberbatch was playing essentially one of the antagonists of the movie, there are a lot of fan theories about who it was going to be. Obviously, one of the fan theories was Khan, because everybody knows that Abrams likes to make a lot of money, and The Wrath of Khan, being the most popular original series movie and the most profitable, that's a no-brainer. However, some of the other fan theories were, one, that Benedict Cumberbatch was playing Gary Mitchell.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned Gary Mitchell as a villain, because they're like, well, maybe he's gonna be this good Starfleet officer turned bad. And then another fan theory was that he was going to be Garth, actually. I don't know if you remember Garth from the original series, but he was the decorated Starfleet captain.
Which one?
Who went crazy. The one where Kirk gets trapped on the insane asylum.
I actually like him.
Yeah. He was supposed to be a decorated Starfleet captain, and kind of everybody knew who he was and thought highly of him, and then he went mad for no discernible reason, and he ended up in an insane asylum. And I think that was another fan theory.
Yeah, we actually didn't talk about Garth because there was in Discovery. I don't know how much of Discovery you watched, but there was a lot of fan theories at the time suspected that one of the main characters would also turn out to be Garth. I think Garth is more popular than we give him credit.
Yeah.
It's not odd because the episode, I actually really like this episode. It has like, it's not the most original episode, but it has it has a nice ending, a very bittersweet ending, and I think that's what stuck with most people. But back to KHAAAN, yes.
Yeah, it turns out it was neither of those fan theories. It was probably the most obvious one, which was that Benedict Cumberbatch was playing Khan. The way Khan was used in Into Darkness was definitely way more involved than it was in The Wrath of Khan. And granted, they had to like somehow, have a reason for him existing in the alternate timeline. But essentially, they were trying to keep his original backstory the same, how he originated with the eugenics war and all of that. Like I talked about earlier, he and his crew fell into the hands of into Starfleet long before it happened in the original series, and they were kept on ice, so to speak, up until this Admiral Marcus comes along and decides to make use of Khan as a spy. And so, because Khan is essentially a superhuman.
Why not?
Why not make him a spy? And so and so they give him this identity called John Harrison. Basically, nobody knows who he really is. He's really this tyrant from old Earth history that, is a war criminal.
Yeah.
So, but things start out in Into Darkness where everything has just been, there's been this terrorist attack, and they discover that it's this person who was a spy working for Starfleet, and, eventually they discover his real identity. And I have to say, Cumberbatch's Khan is really nothing like Montalban's Khan. Okay, just the way he portrays him is he's a lot more calculating, a lot colder, and of course he's hell-bent on revenge. It's another revenge movie, so they did keep that the same, at least. But the difference is that Khan is trying to get revenge on Admiral Marcus. And of course, at the same time, he's trying to figure out a way to free his crew that has been kept in cryosleep, so that he can continue his mission in the same way that Khan of the original series wanted, to have a place to rule over. So he's got a dual purpose in his actions, but primarily it's to get revenge on Admiral Marcus for using him. Sort of like you think you had control over me, but you really didn't, and now you're going to pay for it. I think what I find most interesting about this is that Kirk knows, based on Khan's history, that he's kind of a monster. And he is not someone to take lightly. And yet, to me, it almost seems like Kirk is out of his depth when he is presented with what to do with Khan. Khan talks him into doing a mission with him to secure his crew and whatnot, and he even kind of sells him the sob story of, what would you do in my position if someone was holding your crew's life in their hands? I mean, which is really a laughable argument, because, as we know, Khan is not a good guy, and he really doesn't have any remorse or regret for the things he's done. He just doesn't like the fact that somebody has control over him and are using the lives of his crew to do it. So I'd argue the fact that he probably doesn't care about his crew that much, but they're still useful to him, and they're really kind of his property, and so he probably wants them back. But at the end of the day, basically Khan is he's a bad guy like Marcus, but he's a bad guy. So, because he essentially turns on everybody with his own agenda and destroys Marcus, literally, like squeezes Marcus's head until it pops like a balloon. I mean, like, that's pretty sick.
Yeah.
Just to show his superior strength, right? Yeah. And then of course he tries to decimate Kirk's crew, and then he, runs the Enterprise into San Francisco, and it's a huge mess. Kirk was out of his league the entire movie.
Well, I mean, how much time has passed in canon between the first and the second movies? Because wasn't Kirk just made captain in the first movie?
Only a couple of years. That's a good point. Yeah, so it's supposed to be at that point at which Kirk, because as you know in the first movie, like most everybody, like the Academy classes get decimated in the fight with Nero. Kirk is somehow graduated to captain before he's even actually graduated the academy. But I think this is supposed to be he's supposed to have taken the Enterprise out for like a year or a year and a half long test run and done some missions. But
Okay.
it's before the 5-year mission, and it's kind of like, well, we let you go out and see what you could do, because it's like trial by fire. They just like stuck him in the field and said, let's see how you do.
Yeah, of
And
course.
right, and it's before he actually is awarded long-term captaincy of the Enterprise. So yeah, he's pretty green. He's supposed to be super smart and ambitious, and he wants to do the right thing, and he cares about protecting his crew, and all the typical Kirkian traits that you see from the original series, except given the fact that he's a little more reckless and brash in his decisions. So at that point at which they bring along Khan, it's like you're letting this kid try to deal with this mastermind megalomaniac villain, and it turns out it doesn't work out very well for anyone, because pretty much by the end of the movie they're all just San Francisco's been decimated, people are dead.
What's with this
They're
movie
all
so many people?
yeah, it's, I don't know, for dramatic effect. Let's just kill off, most of the people every single movie. I don't know.
You liked Vulcan? There is no more Vulcan. You liked San Francisco? No more San Francisco.
And that's not to say that they didn't, quote, defeat Khan in some manner, but of course the cost was Kirk's life. And that again was something they tried to lift off of the Wrath of Khan and flip it on its head, because as you know, Spock is the one who dies in the Wrath of Khan.
Yeah.
So Kirk is essentially the one who, I would say, like 99% dies at the end of Into Darkness. I think it's that 1% that where they manage to use the superhuman blood out of the Tribble to bring him back to life. I don't know.
What's the phrase from The Princess Bride? He's mostly dead, not all the way dead.
Pretty much. I mean, I can't. It's hilarious. I really can't talk about it with a straight face, because there's I don't know how you could regenerate a body from superhuman blood.
Yeah.
But I think that was supposed to be the emotional punch in the movie. A lot of people saw it coming, obviously. It's Kirk doing what he does to save everyone, but he didn't sacrifice his ship, right? He sacrificed himself. And but at the end of the day, it's Spock who catches Khan, because Spock is the one, I don't know, in emotional turmoil over Kirk's death or whatever. Khan does get defeated, but he kind of gets tucked away. You know what I mean? So he's not dead. I don't know what that means for the future, but it doesn't end up like the Wrath of Khan as far as his character arc is concerned. In my mind, they're just two separate characters. I know they have the same name. I know they have like some of the same background, but the way the actors portrayed them is completely separate, completely different, and unique. And the way in which their storylines were used were different.
Yeah, that's what I came to say, that they sound like two different characters despite the similarities.
Which I think is what made a lot of people angry about the second movie, because if you're going to reuse a character, you could at least keep him recognizable.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that I thought the plot was terrible, because it was actually kind of clever, but he wasn't the Khan. He wasn't Ricardo's Khan. He wasn't. But he is overall the major villain of the movie, even though the Admiral Alexander Marcus is the secondary villain, the villain you don't know about till about 3/4 of the movie. uh,
Mm-hmm.
into the movie. The real driver behind why Khan is doing what he's doing at the moment. But ultimately, Khan is the one who is the major villain.
And another thing about Khan is that I know that if shipping villains and heroes is popular in a lot of fandoms, and not particularly in Star Trek, but
Yeah.
I do know that there are a lot of people who ship Khan and Kirk, especially in the movies fandom.
I'm going to be honest with you, I don't understand it. Uh, I
I'm
think
just curious: are there like hate shipped, or like do people actually treat Khan like, no, he's actually a good person underneath it all,
Oh
or
no, oh no. Kron is not a good person. Benedict Cumberbatch does not for a second let you believe that Khan is a good person. You can actually see through the ploy, like with Kirk, playing on Kirk's emotions about his own crew to get Kirk to help him. Truly that. It's a ploy, right? You see through it as the audience. So you don't for a second think that Khan is good.
I know, but some fans like to take bad characters and rewrite them a little for fan fiction.
Well, yeah, but I will tell you what I think is what is probably the fascination with Khan and Kirk is that Khan is obviously in control the whole time. Kirk is the one who has to, scramble to rectify his error, or his errors in believing Khan and letting Khan essentially end up taking over the ship because he made the wrong judgment call. And even though you knew he didn't trust Khan, he still made the wrong judgment call, and it came back to bite him in a really terrible way. but
Yeah.
but you see like the power play between the two. It doesn't always feel like Kirk is in control. It pretty much feels like Khan is in control of everything that's happening up until the very end of the movie, where Spock chases him down and punches him in the face. And I personally don't understand the fascination with that power play between Kirk and Khan, but like you said, knowing how fandom likes to treat
Villain.
villains and or protagonists and antagonists, it doesn't surprise me.
So it's popular to like write Khan like he's actually a good person underneath it all.
Yeah, but he's not. What I find fascinating is in the mirror universe stories, Khan is just as bad as he is in the regular universe. There's no like flipping of characterization as is typical. Oh yeah, Khan's not a good guy in any universe. So yeah, there you go.
That's interesting, actually. Well, I think that's
There's one more villain I wanted to mention.
yeah.
Soda, and that's from the third movie, Star Trek Beyond. The main villain of that movie is Krall. The writers, I think, Peg and his co-writer Doug, they they saw some of what had happened in the first two movies. They were mainly revenge plot movies, and they wanted to do something different with the villain in the third movie. So they ended up coming up with someone who has a different kind of reason for, if you will, for his actions.
All right.
How much do you know about Beyond?
Not much.
Okay. Do you mind if I spoil you a little bit?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, basically, they wanted to differentiate him from the main antagonists, Nero and Khan, because they were driven by revenge, right? They wanted his motives to be a little more complex and mysterious. What you end up finding out is that Krall was originally human, and he was the captain of one of the first Federation ship, or one of the first Starfleet ships, right
All right.
after Federation's inception. His name was Edison, okay? Balthazar Edison. And he originally had his roots in the military group prior to Starfleet, back when they were in the Romulan Wars. He comes from a really militarized background, and he's been through wars that decimated millions of people, and he's he's probably got some post-traumatic stress disorder going on there. But what they did was they took the people who survived the wars, like their military leaders, and they put them in charge of Starfleet ships, because they had just, had the whole United Earth thing had just turned into the Federation with the Vulcans and other races. And so now they're supposed to be in charge of space vessels that really don't have a military purpose. They're supposed to be the first explorers of the galaxy on behalf of the Federation. And so Edison goes from being a military captain to a Starfleet captain, and it's different. But what happens is somehow he and his crew end up stranded on this planet on the other side of the galaxy, and in order to survive, they adapt to they learn how to use the alien technology on the planet to modify their genetics so that when other people come down to the planet, they absorb their genetics and they increase their lifespan, but at the same time change how they look and their DNA and all of that. They're as old as heck. They shouldn't be alive being humans, but through these genetic modifications, they have survived longer than you would imagine possible. And through this whole time, it's basically of all his crew that got stranded on that planet, it's him and 2 of his crew are left after like 100 years. Okay?
Right.
He feels bitter that they were never rescued. He and his two crewmen. It's sort of like, we fought for you in the Romulan Wars, and then you just put us on an exploratory vessel, and when we came up missing, you never went to look for us. And he just becomes twisted in his bitterness, and eventually becomes of the opinion that the Federation itself is a mockery of what humans should be doing, that humans should actually, like the Romulans or the Klingons, right? They should not be holding hands with other races. They should be fighting to protect their own race. It's sort of like, he calls it breaking bread with the enemies. That's how he views the Federation. And so he has come up with this plan on how to get off the planet. So he ends up luring the Enterprise there and essentially destroys the Enterprise, gets off the planet with his own little army of alien technology, and goes off to commit a terrorist act against the space station Yorktown. One of many terrorist attacks he has planned, right? And so it's up to Kirk to thwart his efforts. By far, this Balthazar Edison, or this known as Krall, as his alien name is, he is far more complex than either Nero or Khan.
It sounds like it, yeah.
And I think that's really what made the movie more interesting and more Trek-like to a lot of the fans, because he presented this gray area of, what is a villain really like? Did we make this villain through our own actions? I mean, it's not like they condone what he's doing. At the end of the day, Kirk is like, what you fought for in those wars, the peace that you fought for was achieved, and you should be celebrating that. You should not be trying to tear down this peace and unity that we finally achieved as a race with other races. That's kind of the moral of the story.
That actually sounds like a Trek moral.
It is. It's the moral of the story. It's definitely it goes back to one of the tenets of Star Trek. But Krall is just too far gone in his certain belief that what he's doing is for the betterment of the human race. But you don't find out towards halfway through the movie that he was originally a human Starfleet captain. He's the product of his generation, in a way. So, of a generation of Starfleet captains who operated under different tenets because they weren't originally part of what the Federation stood for. It's pretty interesting.
That sounds interesting. Like you said, one day I will get to those movies.
He's really the only other major villain of the reboot universe, but he is a one-time villain because he dies at the end. So you won't see him again. But I think that movie was more in keeping with some of the the one-off episodes of the original series, and where there's a moral to the story, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, these are the villains.
Yes. So we basically talked about some of the main villains that originated from the Star Trek, the original series. We talked about some of the ones that seem more popular in Fanon, probably the major villain of the franchise, at least from original series triumvirate perspective. Excellent. Next time we will talk about the Mirror Universe and the impact it had on the Star Trek franchise. Thanks everyone, and we hope you join us next time.
Bye bye.